Hello, students. This is Ms. Watts, and welcome to my Copyright Guidelines lesson. Please note that the information shared in this Copyright Guidelines lesson is in alignment with the ISTE standard that states that students skillfully use technology resources. So, we should begin by first defining what copyright is. Copyright is basically the legal right to an originator's work. So the copyright owner is the person who, in short, created the work. They have legal rights to the work that they created, and so when someone infringes upon that right to claim that work, or someone else claims that work as their own, and then that leads to a lot of legal issues and a violation of copyright law. So you can't really talk about copyright guidelines unless you bring up the Copyright Act of 1976. And there are a number of copyright acts and laws, but this is the main one that is referred to. It is a United States copyright law that serves as the primary basis of copyright law in the United States. So what are the consequences of violating copyright laws? Well, to violate copyright laws can be very expensive. Possible fines for copyright infringement can cost someone anywhere from $750 to $30,000, depending on the severity of the infringement. If there's proof that the law was broken by any type of willful intention, then the fine could be raised up as high as $150,000. And this type of willful infringement for private or commercial gain also carries a possible fine of $250,000 and possibly up to 5 years in prison. So, in short, just understand that violation of copyright is very serious, and that is why it is important that you understand copyright guidelines and laws and how to avoid pitfalls in infringing upon someone else's work. Fair use. So fair use is defined as the basic criteria an educator can use to determine whether it is appropriate to use copyrighted materials in a classroom setting. And I added this quote on purpose because I wanted you to see an example of how I use someone else's words and ideas and I properly cited, which is something that I am going to explain a little bit more in detail a little bit later on in the lesson. That's also very important when it comes to avoiding copyright pitfalls and infringement. But fair use has many illustrative purposes, and in this lesson, we touch on 4 particular ones. So one of the illustrative purposes of fair use involves criticism or critique. So you may freely use portions of copyrighted materials for the purpose of commentary and criticism. So if you come across a type of copywritten work and you want to share your opinion on it or critique or criticize it in some way, then you can do that without necessarily having to pay credit to the owner of the copywritten work because it's your opinion, it's your thoughts. You're not claiming the work as your own, you're just giving your commentary and opinion. Another illustrative purpose would be news reporting. News reporters may use copyrighted material to report current events, but even this is done to somewhat of a limited degree, and they're also protected by rights of being able to share events with the public. Teaching. Teachers may use copyrighted materials to facilitate instruction in the classroom. Of course, there are certain limits to this. For example, when it comes to copywritten work for teaching purposes, teachers may not necessarily make many copies of a copywritten work, but they could save a backup copy of a copywritten work and use it in instruction. And there's also the illustrative purpose of scholarship and research. And an example of this would be copywritten material being displayed at museums. Criteria for fair use. So there are 4 criteria for fair use. The purpose or character of the use. This involves the use of a copyrighted work for an educational purpose as opposed to using it for commercial gain or entertainment. Another criterion would be the amount of copywritten work used. Fair use typically involves using a smaller amount of copywritten work as opposed to a larger amount. So when it comes to copywritten work, the aim and the goal should always be to create your own work and just use the copywritten work at a minimum. You don't want to base your whole work on someone else's thoughts and ideas, but you can use someone else's thoughts and ideas to support or counteract your own. Another criterion would be nature of the copyrighted work. So the work is more likely to be considered fair use if it is for general readership and not for profit. So the copyright owner is the only one who has the right to gain profit from his or her own work, not someone who is referring to it or using it for secondary purposes. And also the effect of the use of the copyrighted work. This refers to any type of use of copywritten work that negatively impacts the ability for the copyright owner to gain rightful profit. This would be a violation of fair use. So, how do we seek permission to use copyrighted materials? Well, that leads us to the discussion of primary and secondary sources. And we have to know what these are because this is going to make a differentiation between who owns a particular work and who is using the work as a source. And this also ties into how to gain permission or how to, if we can't gain permission, how do we properly cite and give acknowledgement of ownership to the proper person. So primary sources are sources acquired by first-hand accounts and created by observers of the event at the time that it occurred. Examples would include diaries, letters, interviews, oral histories, and photographs. So, in a nutshell, primary sources are more so created and they are more so originated work. This would be the copywritten work that we are talking about. So let's just say, for example, you are fortunate enough to witness a historical event and you want to write a report on what you saw and what you experienced. That's not based off of anyone else's experience. That's based off of your experience. So your written work would be the primary source. And anyone who refers to your work or uses your work as something to cite, that would be a secondary source for that person. So what are secondary sources? Secondary sources are sources that were created by someone without firsthand experience. Examples would include journal articles, textbooks, dictionaries, and encyclopedias, biographies, and newspaper editorials. So these sources are basically what you would end up using if you were writing a research paper to support your ideas. Say you have an idea or a critique and you want to use research to support or to counteract your ideas, then secondary sources would be your go-to. But when it comes to secondary sources, you have to give credit. And how do you give credit? Through citations. What is a citation? A citation is how we give credit to the sources that we use, whether in text or in a reference list. If you remember earlier, I was presenting the in-text citation of a definition for fair use a few slides ago. That's an example of how we give proper citation in text. And in text meaning you would write that citation in a reference paper or in a presentation. How we would present a citation in a reference list would look like this. So this is an example of a citation that I use in this very lesson from a textbook. And note that this citation is written in MLA format, but there's also other formats as well, such as APA, that you can use to properly cite. So what is plagiarism and how do we avoid it? Plagiarism is the practice of claiming someone else's work as your own. So to go back to the example that I gave about you being the witness of a historical event and wanting to write a diary entry or a book about it, that's your own work. But if someone else were to come along and read your story or your manuscript and decide it was a great story or it was a great idea and they want to replace your name as the author and put their own, then you've just been plagiarized. And plagiarism is a big deal. Again, it is a form of copyright infringement that could lead to heavy fines and possibly even time in prison. So, in short, what are some copyright do's and don'ts? Copyright do's: make sure that you acquire permission to use secondary sources. Cite all secondary sources. Keep your copywritten sources to limited use. Be the creator and originator of your own work. And copyright don'ts: do not claim someone else's work as your own. Do not overuse other copywritten work. Do not assume that just because you cannot find copyright information on a source that the source is not copywritten. And do not leave out citations. And just to lead by example, this is a reference of the textbook that I used for some of the information that I shared in this lesson. And I thank you so much for tuning in to my copyright guidelines lesson. And I am excited for you as you embark upon your journey to be responsible researchers. Take care.